Hi. It's very rare that I hold a mic without I don't have a stand and a guitar in front of me, so my comfort level is, well, I feel comfortable with you all. I also feel a little bit like I'm Phil Donahue. That's, I'm glad some of you know who that is. Sometimes I use that cultural reference and everyone's like, we have no idea who that is. No one dives across an audience like Phil Donahue. So, whether it's Dr. Oz or no one does that. Someone should bring that back. Don't worry, Jesse, I won't. I'd like to, first of all, thank Spitfire and the Recording Academy and also the Office of Film and Music for inviting me to come speak to you all. And for their great work supporting musicians and supporting arts culture. It's super important. So I'm just curious, how many people here are musicians or work in music? And how about film? And how about tech? And just sort of design fucking shit up. Okay, good. That's a very important thing. Don't worry about that. Cool. So I am a musician. I also worked as a curator, an independent curator, and I worked in sound art and in arts production. I like to say that if you're a working musician, unless you're just extremely successful, that you have a lot of hyphens in your job title. So that's my case. But I have a very strong, lifelong relationship with music and with musicians. My first memory is of music. Petula Clark Downtown, hearing that on the radio. Yeah, good one. And I basically worked in community and nonprofit radio for a long time, both on air and behind the scenes. I worked in retail for a long time, worked at a couple different independent record stores in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up and where I came of age, as I like to say. And then oddly fell into playing music and started playing in 1989 in what I like to call the previous century. Because it is the previous century. It's not only me calling it that, that's what it is. So then I played with a couple different people, and then in 1991, I played a show with a great musician and drummer named Scott Pluff at the International Pop Underground Festival in Olympia, Washington on the first night of that festival, which is known now affectionately as Girl Night. And we just kind of went from there. I put out a couple singles with a band, with a label in Portland called Imp, and then we signed to Sub Pop. We put out 3 albums with Sub Pop. Scott left and played in Built to Spill, which he just completed his tenure with Doug after 16 years or 17 years. And then I have continued to play with different people and perform solo. So for those of you who don't know me, that's a little bit of the overview. It's not the Rebecca show, don't worry. And just wanted to give a little background of where I'm coming from, because a lot of why I started actually playing after being involved with music emotionally and as a life guide for many, many years was because of the Pacific Northwest indie scene and punk scene, and spending a lot of time in Olympia and being part of the KBOO community in Portland, Oregon. KBOO is the Pacifica station down there, still rocking it. And then basically started working full time after the first record came out by the Spinades on Sub Pop. I ended up taking a bit of a break from music. I put out an album on a small label. It's really funny, at that time in 2001, it was called an EP. It makes me laugh because now Jack White's records and the Spoon records are like 29 minutes. I'm like, see, it is an album. It was an album. It wasn't just an extended play. It wasn't a maxi cassette single that just went, didn't make it to an album. And then after taking some time off and working, as I said, more in sound art and doing more arts, contemporary visual art and production and work, I self-released a record 2 years ago, sort of self-released. I'm very fortunate to have a label from Austin called When2XU do the vinyl, but I did the digital release, and I still hand assemble my CDs. So if you order a CD on my website, I hand assemble it and I send it to you. So I'm still, after all these years, very much DIY. And some of that is a lot of that is economics, but a lot of it is also just the kind of connection that I've always had to people who think about music and work in music in that way. So the other thing that I realized when I started doing these sort of conversations and doing more cultural policy work is that I realized that the underlying theme and sort of the underlying through line of all my work is sound and space. So whether that is literally playing music in a room or trying to translate music from sort of the woods and wires into the O's and ones of the digital age, to how sound defines the community and sort of audio geography and things that I'm more interested in now, to cultural policy and legislation. Like there's this kind of constant focus on sound and space, and not in the Neil Tyson's sense of space, on the room architectural sense of space. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this is something that Michael touched on when we were talking about a perspective that I can offer, is that when I started playing music and was very fortunate to follow this sort of time sort of Jacob's ladder of you make a cassette, then you're on a compilation, then someone asks you to do a single, then someone asks you to do a single, and someone asks you to do an album, and you just kind of keep trying to show up and do good work. And the structure with labels and with distribution and with press and all of that was something that allowed that to happen. I benefited very much from that time era, but I'm also a huge fan of music and rock and roll, and am aware of the different iterations that music, and especially rock and roll, has taken, from the 1950s of selling albums out of the back of station wagons at a country show, through the sort of San Francisco scene and things that happened in also in London in the 60s, and just there's always kind of this dominant narrative of what music is and what the music business is and how you should operate and what must be done, and that time is this time. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about having the history I have in terms of playing and continuing to try and play, and also being a fan, is that there's this really amazing history of different facets of how music has tried to function as a business and how musicians have continued to play music. And we're at a point now that's really interesting, because technology obviously has really highly impacted a lot of all of music. And I do probably more interviews about streaming and the effects of streaming on musicians than anything else. Right now, that's obviously a hot topic and has been. But I think those kind of things just come up, and it depends who is handling who's in charge of sort of the narrative, who's taking that at that time. So maybe in the 70s, it was cock rock FM radio, and that was how you were supposed to be a musician. And then, Chrissie Hynde showed up, and The Clash showed up, and Elvis Costello showed up, and then suddenly you could be a woman, or you could be British, you could be, it's and so now we're in this thing where it's just this whole scattershot of different ways that you engage. And one of the things that I feel like I'm always trying to point out to musicians and people who work in the business, and I think that this is something as I've talked to filmmakers, and I've talked to startup technicians, and I've talked to people doing different work in different parts of sort of the cultural industry, is that there's still this concept of how you're supposed to do your work. And some of that is, common sense. You should be trying to make money, you should be paying your taxes, you should, there's just sort of basic things. But I'm also the person who's always why? Why are we supposed to do it that way? I mean, when we started playing music, we didn't have a bass player, and that was not a strategic, that wasn't anything manipulative. It was sort of we didn't get around to having a bass player. And then we played a show, and people liked the band, and then we kind of learned to play together. So, it didn't really matter. And then I spent the first 2 or 3 years after the Spinanes record came out answering questions about why we didn't have a bass player. And if there's ever any sort of justice in the world with the Black Keys and Jack White, Dan and Jack will have to be in a room and have to answer every question that I had to answer for 2 years. Also heavens to Betsy and Mecca Normal. But I'm rambling a little bit, but the whole point is that I think that one of the things that's interesting is to think about how we chose to work then and what made the group of people, especially in this part of the country, which I've spent a lot of time all over the U.S. and been fortunate to go all over the world, and there's different scenes, and definitely there was the Simple Machines Discord scene in D.C. and every SST, LA, but I was from here, and to me the most punk rock band, and I still love having this conversation, is not Black Flag, but it's Beat Happening. And to me, someone who was really just going to turn everything upside down and be like, well, we don't really care. This is what we do. And they were basically one of the bands that when I saw them and heard them, I was like, oh, I could play music. Another big influential band for me was a band called Glass Eye, who is out of Austin, Texas, who Kathy McCarty still is playing, and she's an incredible guitarist. And I think as much as I used to be in the front row at Satyricon in Portland at Green River shows and be like, I just want to watch, Stone, and I just want to watch Steve Turner and all these guys, Dwayne Dennison from Jesus Lizard is one of my favorite guitarists too. When I saw Kathy play, I was like, oh my, I understand that. I don't feel like I have to go home and play a bunch of licks and learn my Jimmy Page solos so that I can be on, because also I never really cared about being on stage. It was just such an important thing, and then that sort of ended up happening. So it was this really lovely moment that I'm really fortunate to have been a part of, where there's this organic scene, and then there started to be more organizing principles in terms of labels and in terms of cities and in terms of venues, in terms of print, like Maximum Rock and Roll. And so the thing that's really funny is that actually right now there are corollaries and there are parallels for all of that right now in so many different directions. And there's so many people doing really interesting work, from reissues like with Light in the Attic and with Numero Group to people doing their own releases. So the thing that to me is that's it is I always call it self-starter. Not DIY. I was saying I love DIY and I'm a big supporter of it, but I also feel like next thing you know, you're talking about knitting in campgrounds, and I really like keeping it sort of around the idea of music. So, whether it's your own, and so then the question becomes, and this is something I know that you guys probably, because you're here and because the kind of work you do, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I feel one of the things that's really important is to actually remind each other that there are some tools that are really effective, but there's a lot of value in trying to establish the work, the framework for the work that you do in a way that makes sense for you. And that is one of the moments that we have right now with technology and with the sort of whole spectrum of ways of working. That said, there's a lot of people who are still, and especially companies and corporations who are still saying this is what, if you want to put out a record, this is what you have to do. And you put out a record do you want it to be digitally distributed? Well, you have to, if you're not big enough, you have to go through TuneCore and you have to pay this fee, or you have to do this. You go to Bandcamp and pay this fee, and you have to do this and pay this. And I think one of the things that I'm always encouraging musicians to do, and I'd be curious to know if this is something that filmmakers and startups come up with too, is there is actually that opportunity to kind of say how do I want to spend my day? How do I want my work to be restorative or sustainable? Do I want it to be a business? What kind of focus am I going to put on it? Do I want to give some music away? I don't have to give all of my music away. Do I want to give none of my music away? Do I want to use a Kickstarter? Do I want to do, and I have to say that one of the reasons why I'm deep in these questions is I continue to play music. I kind of tried to not put out records for a long time and not play shows, and I was actually pretty unhappy. So one of the things is for me to kind of recognize at some point that I'm a lifer, and I seem to make music that at least some people want to hear, and that's really nice. So how do I kind of get to do something I really enjoy and that other people enjoy as well, and how can that be something that is actually restorative and not something that I have to kind of deplete my bank account, deplete myself emotionally, and affect my families and my friends and all of that. So my point is that I'm here to offer some things and some questions and ways of thinking that myself and my peers have kind of come to, and I'm sure that you all have solutions that are really that I don't know about. But I'm very much asking the questions, and I'm not here to say like, yeah, man, I'm rich, and I just fly over and play London, and then I come back, and then I just sit in my backyard and pick raspberries. I'm like, I work a lot of different jobs. I'm trying to figure out like who my audience is. Does anybody want to pay for music anymore? If they don't want to pay for music, like what do they want to pay for? Do I, so all of these questions are very front and center for me. But one of the things that gets me really riled up is what I mentioned before, is when someone's like, oh, well, if you want to do this, this is how you do it. And what I find is that usually that person has an agenda that doesn't really coincide with my agenda necessarily. So one of the things that I think is a struggle, and I know is a struggle, is that now there's this concept of DIY, and you can do everything yourself. And as I said, it's good. There is that opportunity to kind of make a lot of decisions and choose what you want to live with. But Sony Records had a staff of thousands, if not millions, globally. I haven't really done the research. I probably should. They had millions or billions of dollars, and they couldn't figure out how to make a hit record. No one has ever been like, this is how you make a hit record. Yeah, you got it? All right, you can tell me. I mean, obviously there's guidelines, but one of the things is that, as independent artists and as independent makers, that's something that like we have to deal with now. It's like, are you going to market? What's your social media? What's your strategy? How are you going to do this? Who are you? I'm like, I don't know who I am. That's an existential question. I'll have that existential discussion, but not about like whether you're going to use my song for free in your YouTube video with some like political content that I don't agree with. So, there's a lot that you can go in super deep, or you can not, and that is not reassuring in a lot of ways, but I actually find it really reassuring, because for me at this point I can be like, well, I sold 2 t-shirts on my website. That's great. Someone has a t-shirt and I have $40, minus the cost and minus that. No. But I think one of the things that's also interesting is that a lot of the time too, this discussion gets caught up in money, and I think it's a really important thing to pay attention to, and I think it's a really important thing. It's a moment that we have as independent makers to take possession kind of that conversation, and not say, oh, there's this larger economic framework of a label or of a movie house or of a distributor that I have to go and say, if I'm going to work at all, that's what I have to do. Like, now you have different options. But at the same time, it's just, like I said, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but it's something that is a lot to navigate. One of the things that I've found is that there are, because of sort of where we are in technology these days, and because of a lot of stuff that's going around placemaking and cities, and a lot of conversation that's coming out in just different cultural areas, that there's starting to be more nuanced response to what makers need, right? So even if it's as simple as like Vimeo coming after YouTube, coming after like, can you stream, what are technologies to stream your own film or your album on your website? And one of the things that I can offer is that there's a basic checklist of Cash Music is as a small nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. They're still in beta phase, but this is my I'm giving you some answers part of the program. But this is something that I think is really imperative, and I'm a big supporter of them, because what they are saying is that it's an open source. They're on GitHub, like open source network, and I release the digital download for my record myself on my website. I get all the money except for the PayPal fee. And frankly, like, I think that PayPal, for better or worse, like, they offer a service that I like and that I find useful, and I don't mind paying them for that. And I think that's another important part of this conversation, is that as we as culture makers and artists start demanding tools that are more effective for us, to also recognize, like, yes, we will pay. We will, if they're, like, I have a store that's hosted on Big Cartel, and I pay them $10 every month. Like, they offer me a service that I really think is useful, and I've made that choice, and it's economically correct for me, and I use it. So I think it's just this weird thing where you have to take a day. I literally tell musicians sometimes, you have to take a day or an evening or a week or get together with friends, and then, like, if you actually really want to think about this, and just do some investigation. So even today, I book myself. I should have said that at the beginning. I'm my own I've always managed myself. I book myself at this point. I am Donald Trump. For me, you're looking at it. But one of the things that came up was, I was talking to someone about booking, and I'm very fortunate because I have a history, and I'm also very professional, and I'm pretty kind, and I like meeting people. So I'm still in this position where I can, because of all the years that I put in, I can call someone in Tucson and say, hey, Solar Culture, we're coming through. Would you like to do a show? And that's something that I'm very privileged to be able to have, and not everybody has that. But that said, there's a website called indieonthemove.com, and basically someone has gone through, and they do great work, and it's like, here's the capacity, here's the contact person, here's what they offer, here's the directions, and it seems to be pretty up to date. There's one that's called indievenuebible.com that seems to be a cost to use it, but it seems effective for people that I checked in with. So this is the thing, is like, there's not someone who's kind of like, you need to work this way, you're going to have to do some legwork. But at the end of the day, what I found is that I'm actually in a position where I'm finding things that feel restorative, and I can choose what community I want to be a part of. And I can bring it back to what made me want to start playing initially, which was community and a love of music, and just that real, like, kind of fire, like campfire hearth orientation that music and music culture offers. Are there any arts lawyers here? And I love you, by the way. Like, this isn't a call out. No, I was trying to figure out. Actually, this is sort of a sidestep, but pro bono hours. Like, I know when you're a lawyer at a firm, they recommend that you do a certain percentage of your work as pro bono. And I was thinking about how interesting that would be as independent makers, whether you're, whatever field you're working in, like, how much work, when I start looking at my business, how much work is marketing and pro bono, and how much work is actually effective. And it's a little bit painful for me sometimes to actually really, like, put the glaring white lights on it. But it's also really interesting for me because it helps me make an informed choice. And I think one of the things that's really scary for me personally, and is something that a lot of the music industry has always banked on, and new music tech continues to bank on, is potential and hope. And that if you just do this, maybe you'll break through, and there's a lot of hard work that has to go into it, and we worked really hard, even though some of it, seemed easy because we had help from labels and from booking agents. But I think that one of the things that's really interesting is to say, how can I be a working artist in whatever my field, and actually start making things make sense? And sure, send up some flares and be like, oh, we'll see if this happens, we'll see if this works. But not be caught up in this thing where, well, if you only sign up to TuneCore and Bandcamp and iTunes, and you keep giving away percentages of your money, even though no one's really guaranteeing you anything or helping you make anything, like, you just might hit it big. So, that's a big problem that I have, and I think that once we start moving past that kind of conversation, that our culture is just going to get more robust. And I think, so that generally one of the main thing that I wanted to share with you all is that here I am, and I know that there's people who think that I can do whatever I want, and like I said, sit in the backyard and pick raspberries and make pies, because I had this record that people really love that came out, 20 years ago with Manos. I'm very thankful for that. But actually I work, I'm really in deep and thinking about how interesting our time is in order to, in that we can frame our communities, and we can choose how to work, and we can network, and there's a wide range of peers of mine that are doing everything from, flying to play the Newport Folk Festival or Primavera
to someone who just like, she just posted today, this man Houndstooth, who's from Portland, who's really great, and Katie just posted on Instagram that Spin put their video up and called them Dreamy Pop, and she's like, I'm freaking out, Spin Magazine, and I texted her and I was like, Spin Magazine, really? I mean, congrats. And she started laughing. She's like, I know, but it's still really cool, like that, you know. And it is. It's like you never know where traction is going to come from. You never know where you're going to talk to someone. And I think that's really interesting. And I'm not as familiar with that kind of culture in film, so sorry that I can't speak to that. But actually, one of the things that I find really interesting is that as I've started to work more on sort of broader cultural policy issues, that I get to meet people who are dealing with issues of like gender issues in tech startups. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That's the same kind of problem that, you know, we are like navigating in music. It's the same kind of thing that someone's navigating in film. And that I feel like we all we're very protective. I am very protective. Like, I think music is the best. And I talked to theater people and they're like, no, theater is the most effective, best art form. And someone who's coding is like, you don't even know how to code, so don't talk to me about like what you think coding is good or bad. So we all have our loyalty to our practice, which is totally amazing. But I think that there's solutions that are in other disciplines that we sometimes don't have access to. And that's a really huge thing that I'm working on. It's like, what is happening over here in tech, like maybe with like a GitHub kind of focus or something like that, that no one in music is doing because everyone's just trying to like get their YouTube video to go viral. And vice versa, like what can we learn, what can people learn from the music community and the sort of deep network that we have and the way that we touch people just the minute we open our mouths and sing or play with our, you know. So I think that that's and that's one thing I love about having the Office of Film and Music, or having people kind of say like, how can we work together on things, how can we support our own practices? So any sort of revelatory business practices that you want to share with me as a non-musician to a musician, or even as a musician, I'm all ears. And one of the things that I wanted, like I said, I wanted to share, this is my PowerPoint. Do you guys like it? Like, the audio person's like, oh, those papers are rustling, oh my God. I really like bodies and humans and voices, and so I try to not, you know, if I could, I would be talking from the back of the room, but that doesn't work with the sound system frequently. But I did want to give a couple things in terms of music, and then I'm going to wind it up pretty quickly unless there's, you know, questions, mostly just because this is being videotaped and I'm starting to really sweat, and I do have little female pride, so you know, I'm not really vain, but I don't really want to be like, whoa, she was really sweating. It's like, I feel like there must be some sort of Grammy moment like that. It's not quite nip slip, but you know. Let's see, Cash Music I talked about. They need support. They need coders. They are doing really great work, but they've got a huge project on hand, so check them out. Sound Exchange is something that not a lot of musicians know about. I mean, I might be, you know, if you guys are here with these two great nonprofits hosting, then you probably do know about this stuff, so sorry if you don't, but in case you don't, Sound Exchange was given the authority to distribute monies from all the digital money that's collected. So their website was very difficult for a while, but it's gotten much better in terms of their interface. If you have ever put out a record or written a song, register with Sound Exchange. They are holding a lot of money still for people who haven't registered. BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC, very effective, and still doing their thing. I know there's a lot of argument in terms of fees for venues with BMI and ASCAP and all that. That's good. I like having spirited conversations about whys and what works people do, but I'm a proud BMI member and have been for a long time. You have AFM, you have Grammys, you have your local, the office here in Seattle is an amazing resource. We have nothing like that in Portland. We don't even have an arts policy director in Portland. It's ridiculous, but that's a different talk. People know about Kickstarter in terms of crowdfunding. There's also Pledge Music, which is specific to music, and Artist Share, which is specific to music. I'm really interested. I will probably have to do a Kickstarter to do a record sometime this year. I've been putting it off for 5 years. But one of the things that I really like about Pledge Music and Artist Share is that it's music specific. So you have people who are really looking to support that community. There's a new tool that's coming out of Portland called Generous, with .us as the end there. And Russell Brand, the British comedian, just did his book through Generous, and it's basically choose your own price, and part of it goes to charity. These are really cool tools that people are starting to innovate and make functional, and they have a community thread. They're not quite open source, but they are interested in doing a lot of helping people just get access to capital so that they can continue to do their work. There's a website that I adore, especially if anyone here is a nonprofit filmmaker, because that's where the community came out of. It's called Sparkwise. A woman named Wendy Levy, who did a lot of work with the Ford Foundation, and she realized that there was no real way to measure impact of nonprofit campaigns, especially film campaigns. So that's something that's targeted towards that, but can be used for anything. So like I'm going to try it for my record. So that's sparkwise.se, like it's from Sweden. But I'll try and figure out either with Kate or Michael or both, like in case anybody's interested, or else you can just find me on Twitter and ask. I mentioned the 2 booking things, which are really good. And yeah, at the end of the day, like I said, it's all kind of it's a big question, and I really learn a lot from. I'm very fortunate to be involved with a lot of people in Portland who are doing design work and design thinking, and also nationally with a really kick-ass group of musicians who are trying to work in terms of keeping us all going and being able to contribute and deal with the fact that at the end of the day, there's been a lot of new business built on the back of our culture and our content, and that's a problem. And I'm just kind of not Pollyanna about it at all, but I think that what we can do is try and be resilient and find some new strategies to respond, because music business and the history of the music business has always been changing. It's always been in the last 100 years, it's been based on hardware. You know, whether it was a stereo, a radio, hi-fi, computer, like we've always been impacted by it. We've always come back. There's always been some shift. So it's just a matter of sort of trying to keep chin up and develop some new strategies. That said, I'm going to put in a little bit of a last word on from my pulpit on being involved in terms of legislation, if that's anything that's at all interested to you or to someone you might know. I work with the Future Music Coalition. They're a really good resource. They're a nonprofit based in DC. I also work with Air Traffic Control, who do a lot of social justice work. They're based in the Bay Area. They're formed around the Beastie Boys concert for Tibet and the Milarepa Foundation. And they're doing a lot of work around immigration right now, but they also do everything. They have a lot of strategies for touring bands and for small and large bands to have an impact on issues that we care about. But this summer is copyright is up for review in our Congress. Net neutrality is a big issue this summer, or open access, as some people refer. If you're like, I don't know what that is, feel free. My name is Rebecca Gates at Twitter, and just be like, hey, I don't know what that is, and I'll send you some links. That's one of my passion projects right now, because I feel like we have this moment right now that's very heavily challenged. But I was at the Copyright Office and I was at the FCC last month, and there are people there who are looking for stories from independent artists and makers. So it's kind of our job to step up and give them those stories, regardless of what happens. And there's also the songwriters, the performers' royalties for radio that a lot of my peers are working on. So those are a couple things. Like I said, feel free to find me on Twitter and ask questions. You can also, my website is the obscure word parsematone, but if you just search me, you can get linked to that, and you can do info at, and I look at that, or my friend does. And I think that's it. I'm really happy that you all took the time to come by. I'm glad that you are committed to your work and your community to get a drink and sit in a nice room. But thank you so much, and I appreciate it.